Welcome back to session 4. This one, the question we're addressing is, do I have to obey the law? The scripture, or the sermon by John Wesley we're using is the law established through faith. Let's be clear about what this is and what this is not. When we were asking people about questions to engage with in this session, a dominant question was, do I have to obey the speed limit? This is not that conversation. This is about, do I have to obey the law of the Old Testament?
Wait a minute, I obey speed limits.
Always?
Well, if your mother's in the car, I don't obey that because she's in such a hurry and she doesn't like to do that. So I limit myself to 5 over.
Okay, so legitimate question. Are you always a rule follower?
Pretty much. I really work hard at following rules because I think that's the best way to live. You live a good life by following the rules and being a good citizen, a good Christian.
You all, by the way, just got a nice preview into what it was like to grow up with him. Every single rule is worth following. You're supposed to make your bed every morning. You're supposed to do a whole set of things for which I have never found purpose and value yet. See, I think when you read Scripture, like my small group, again, is reading Scripture from Genesis to Revelation, basically. And when I read it, there are all these places where I sit there and go, oh my goodness, I cannot believe this is a rule. All of these commandments, 613 commandments by tradition in the Old Testament. This is an insane number of rules. How in the world are we actually supposed to follow them, Mr. Rule Follower?
Well, as you well know, we Christians don't have to follow them all. This got settled in a Jerusalem conference of the apostles. The Christians began to distinguish from that time on between the commandments that were called moral and the commandments that were ceremonial and the commandments that were civil.
The challenge, though, is how are we actually, as normal Christians, supposed to differentiate between this? In your mind, how would you explain to your congregation the rules they ought to follow, the rules we ignore? How do you balance that?
At the heart of what we're talking about here is the relationship between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Clearly, in the New Covenant, the New Testament, there's been a change. Jesus has come. There's a new way of salvation that's open to Gentiles. There's a new community being formed. That's a crucial change.
In fact, if you read the Old Testament, it actually gives you explanations for this all the time. We ignore it because we read just tiny little sections.
We live in a culture that values self-expression and liberty. We run into people all the time who don't want anybody telling them what they can't do, and they don't really understand that the law frees us. Your older brother, Jameson, had to be in at a set time every night, and he knew that if I was going to start driving around town looking for him, it would not be pretty when I found him. So by and large, he made this friend bring him home. Well, one night he was getting out of the car, and the friend said, "You have to be home at this time." Jameson said, "Yeah, it really is terrible." And the friend said, "I wish my parents loved me enough to set rules for me to follow." That stuck with your brother. I think this is where we need a different view of the law. And Wesley is trying to teach people that the law and the gospel are really two sides of the same coin. And so the text for this sermon that we're talking about comes from the book of Romans, where Paul says, do we make void the law? No. In fact, the Greek phrase there is almost an exclamation point. Better translated, absolutely not. We establish the law. We live according to the law. It becomes an important part of who we are. And so for Wesley, the way of salvation is moving out of our sin into a saving relationship with Christ, and then bit by bit becoming the kind of people who bring the law and following the law, obedience to the law, into our lives.
John Wesley used the Sermon on the Mount on a regular basis, the place where Jesus quoted the Old Testament passage. He says, you've heard that it was said, do not kill your neighbor. But what I say to you is you must love your neighbor. You know, when you hear an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, I say to you, you're to turn the other cheek. Actually doubling down on how important it is to live deeply faithful lives where we live by it, not just by the ritual purity of I did this, I didn't kill anyone this week, but going further to say, yeah, but did you love anyone this week? And getting to the heart of what the law was supposed to be.
Well, as citizens, in the United States at least, we live in a democratic country where our rule of law is part of what allows people of different religions and different cultures to live together. It's really the lowest common denominator. On the other hand, we've seen an explosion in the number of laws, and so sometimes there are some silly laws that have been passed that don't make a lot of sense. And yet, from my point of view, the New Testament says as a citizen I'm supposed to have respect for the authorities and follow the laws as much as I possibly can.
At the same time that I know that for the early Christians, following Jesus was actually a crime. And for the African American leaders of the 1950s and 60s, they violated a lot of laws civil laws, in order to live into a higher faithful following of Jesus. So that my way of articulating that would be, in general, you are supposed to follow the law. Civil law in our democratic society. But God's law is higher and most important. And so if God's law calls you to break the civil law, that is a different ballgame, and there is such a thing as doing the right thing in spite of our government and in spite of laws that exist.
Part of what we learned in the civil rights movement, though, is that committing civil disobedience like that has to be done with the intent of changing it and a willingness to accept the punishments out of respect for the civil authorities. The New Testament assumes that the beginning point is respect for and obedience to the civil authority, because that's part of what makes life possible in this world.
And yet we're called to be higher than that. I think your differentiator of the lowest common denominator of, you can hate somebody and not violate any civil laws, but you're certainly violating the laws that Jesus has for us.
Well, you certainly want to put a priority on Jesus' law. So if somebody forbade me from feeding hungry people, I would go ahead and do it. We have some questions that have been sent in. As we told you, Arthur and I have never seen these questions before, but we'll turn to one right now. How do we obey the law if we don't know all the commandments? What if they don't know all the commandments, Arthur?
Well, you know the two most important. Jesus says that there are two greatest commandments. The first is, you shall love the Lord with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength. And then he says the second is like it. You've got to love your neighbor as yourself. Here's the deal. If you're loving God and you're loving your neighbor and you're doing it with every last ounce of your soul, you're going to be adhering to those other commandments. Loving God and loving neighbor is the summary, Jesus' summary of all of those commandments. Do we have one more? I think we have. Oh, this one is anyone besides Jesus and Arthur's father perfect? No. Sorry, I ad-libbed there. Is anyone besides Jesus perfect? No.
That's the quick answer, yeah. But what do you mean by perfect, Arthur?
Oh, man. See, I thought I was going to get away with an easy no here. If is anyone besides Jesus perfect? Perfection is doing the will of God. And we are all fundamentally broken in one way or another. And so as we come to know God, we can become less broken. We can be healed. That's part of our sanctification process.
What about Elizabeth Snell?
Man, okay, so there are some people who are saint. Elizabeth Snell, also known as Mama Snell, was a saint of Howe United Methodist Church. I'm here to tell you, by the time she was in her 90s and I knew her, there was one time we were driving up to church and she was sweeping the parking lot of the church so that people would have a good experience when they came that day. She was in her 90s. I'll tell you, no, you aren't perfect, but I do believe you ought to be able to get close to that in your lifetime, and I know that because I met one of them.
So when I talk about perfection, meaning being a mature Christian and growing up, my vision for that, if I can get anywhere close to what Elizabeth Snell was like, I will have accomplished something significant in my life. Obeying the law, yeah, that's part of the Christian's journey. To figure out how God's grace can help us to be as committed to Christ and as holy as possible. Is it easy? No. That's why it takes God's grace and a lifetime's journey toward the goal of being a grown-up Christian.
As we end today, I want to remind you of what my brother's friend said. His friend said, "I wish my parents loved me enough to place rules on me." That's how I view the New Testament. That's how I view the Old Testament. It's how I view Jesus. He loves us enough to ask us to be better than what we were and would otherwise be.
I think one of the songs that's been very meaningful to me, written by Charles Wesley, is "A charge to keep I have, a God to glorify, a never-dying soul to say to fit it for the sky. To serve the present age, my calling to fulfill. Oh, may it all my powers engage to do my Father's will." I want to be the kind of person who spends his time, his money, uses his talents to obey God's commandments. It's a charge to keep, and I think it's an important way of conceptualizing the Christian life.